If that dog takes one more step back, Lieutenant, we're going in without him." The words cut through the dry Afghan morning like a blade, sharp enough to make every SEAL at the tunnel mouth turn and stare. Atlas stood frozen at the entrance, his black and tan body rigid beneath his tactical harness, one front paw lifted off the dust as if the ground itself had spoken to him. The tunnel ahead was barely 4 feet wide, carved into the side of a sun-baked ridge behind a row of abandoned mud-brick homes. Inside, darkness swallowed the beam of every flashlight. The air coming out of it smelled old, metallic, and wrong. Lieutenant Emily Carter kept one gloved hand on Atlas's collar and said nothing. She was 32, pale-skinned, steady-eyed, with blonde hair tucked under a sand-colored helmet and a face too calm for the pressure gathering around her. To the men behind her, she looked almost delicate under the weight of her plate carrier, radio, sidearm, and medical pouch. But her stillness had nothing soft in it. It was the kind of stillness that came from learning not to waste motion when seconds mattered. Senior Chief Ryan Maddox stood 6 feet behind her, jaw tight, rifle angled safely down, eyes fixed on the black opening. His team had lost contact with Bravo 2 18 minutes earlier somewhere beneath that ridge. 2 SEALs were inside, alive according to the last broken transmission, but the signal had faded to little more than static and breath. The drone they sent in had gone dark after 20 feet. The small ground robot had lost connection after 30. Now their best chance was Atlas, the K-9 trained to find hidden paths, explosives, and men who could no longer call for help. Except Atlas would not enter. Petty Officer Blake Harris gave a short laugh from the rear of the stack, the kind of laugh men use when fear needs somewhere to hide. "Great," he muttered. The hero dog picked now to be scared. A few eyes shifted toward Emily. No one smiled, but no one corrected him either. The pressure was too high, the clock too loud. Somewhere beyond that tunnel, 2 teammates were running out of air, and every second Atlas refused to move felt like betrayal. Emily lowered herself slowly beside him, boots grinding softly into the dust. Atlas did not whine. He did not bark. His ears were forward, his nose working in short, controlled pulls. His gaze was not on the tunnel's darkness. It was lower, left, locked on a place near the ground where loose sand had gathered against a flat stone. Emily watched his breathing, the tightness across his shoulders, the way his tail had gone still without tucking. Not fear. Never fear. A memory flashed behind her eyes before she could stop it. Another road, another dog, another handler who ignored the warning because the team was late. She pushed it down. "Lieutenant," Maddox said, colder now. "If your dog can't work, move aside." Emily lifted her eyes, calm as glass. "He's working." Blake stepped closer, impatience written across his face. "By standing still?" Atlas gave one low rumble, so quiet it barely rose above the radio static. Emily's hand tightened once on his harness, not to restrain him, but to answer him. Then the radio cracked with a broken voice from somewhere under the ridge. "Bravo 2, low oxygen, need extraction." The words turned the whole team silent. Maddox raised one hand, preparing to send the first man in on foot. Emily stood at the same instant and moved in front of the tunnel, blocking the entrance with her body. For the first time, every weapon, every breath, every ounce of frustration in the stack seemed to point at her. Maddox stared her down. "You better have a reason." Emily did not look away. "I do." Emily held Maddox's stare for one measured second, then turned her attention back to the ground. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain herself to the whole team. She only moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned that panic was a luxury. "No one crosses this line," she said. Her tone was calm, but every man heard the order in it. Maddox's jaw flexed. He did not like being stopped in front of his own team, especially not by a handler he had only met 2 days earlier, and especially not when 2 of his men were trapped somewhere beneath solid earth. But something in Emily's posture made him hold his position. She was not guessing. She was reading. Atlas remained beside her, breathing through his nose in short, sharp pulls. His eyes never left the same place on the left side of the tunnel entrance. Blake Harris shifted his weight and looked over Emily's shoulder, trying to see what the dog saw. "I do not see anything," he said. Emily took off one glove and tucked it under the strap of her vest. With 2 fingers, she touched the surface of the sand just outside the opening. The top layer was loose, but beneath it there was a narrow ridge, almost too clean, running across the floor at an angle. It looked like wind had shaped it. But wind did not cut straight lines inside a tunnel. She moved her hand a few inches and found a second detail, one pebble sitting upright against the natural slope, placed rather than fallen. Her eyes narrowed. "Whoever built this wanted us looking forward," she said softly. Maddox stepped closer, careful to keep his boots behind the place she had marked. "What are you seeing?" Emily reached for the small flashlight clipped to her chest and angled the beam low, nearly flat against the dirt. Dust caught the light in a thin golden sheet. At first there was nothing but stone, sand, and shadow. Then Atlas made a small sound in his throat. Emily shifted the beam a few degrees left. A faint glimmer appeared near the base of the wall and vanished. Blake leaned in, frustration fading into confusion. Was that metal? Emily did not answer yet. She lowered herself until one knee hovered above the dirt without touching it. Her face was inches from the tunnel floor now, her cheek catching the warm glow of the flashlight. The opening seemed to breathe around her, pushing out stale air and the smell of rust. Behind her, the men stood in a hard silence, suddenly aware of how loud their gear sounded when they moved. The radio cracked again. "Bravo 2, signal weak." Maddox closed his eyes for half a second, fighting the urge to move. Emily followed the glimmer to the wall. There, half hidden under dust, something hair-thin ran between two dark stones. Not a root, not a crack, too deliberate, too straight. She did not touch it. She only pointed. There. Maddox lowered his flashlight beside hers. The beam crossed Emily's, and the thin line became visible for one clean heartbeat. Blake stopped breathing. A wire, nearly the color of the dust, stretched across the entrance at ankle height before disappearing into a seam in the rock. Atlas had refused the tunnel not because he feared the dark, but because the dark was holding its breath. Emily kept her voice low. "Back everyone up 6 feet. Slow steps. No one kicks dust." For once, no one argued. Boots lifted carefully. Rifles stayed angled down. Even Maddox moved like the ground had become glass. Emily stayed where she was, one hand on Atlas, one finger hovering near the wire without touching it. Blake looked from the wire to the dog, then to Emily, the earlier smirk gone from his face. "How did he know?" he asked. Emily kept watching the tunnel. "Because he was listening before we were." The team eased back one careful step at a time, each boot finding solid ground before the next moved. Dust shifted under them in tiny whispers. No one spoke above a breath. The wire remained where Emily had found it, thin and patient, almost invisible unless the light struck it at the perfect angle. Maddox kept his eyes on it, as if looking away might make it disappear. A minute earlier, he had been ready to send his first man through that entrance. Now the thought sat cold in his chest. Emily clipped her flashlight to the front of her vest, keeping the beam locked low across the tunnel floor. "Call explosive ordnance disposal," she said. Maddox gave the signal without hesitation. A communications specialist stepped back toward the ridge line and began relaying the discovery in a quiet, controlled voice. Blake Harris stood near a broken wall, staring at Atlas with a look he seemed unable to hide. The dog had settled beside Emily, not relaxed, but steady. His ears remained forward. His nose kept testing the air. He was not finished. Emily saw it before anyone else did. Atlas was no longer focused on the first wire. His head had turned slightly to the right, toward a narrow crack in the outer wall of the tunnel, just wide enough for air to move through. She followed his line of sight and saw nothing at first. Only stone, dust, and the broken edge of an old support beam. Then she felt it, a faint current of cooler air brushing against the back of her bare fingers. Not from the main tunnel, from somewhere else. "There is another opening," she said. Maddox looked toward the crack. A side passage, maybe a ventilation cut, maybe an escape route, but air is moving through it. Blake shook his head, still trying to catch up. The map showed one entrance. Emily looked at him once. "Then the map is wrong." She moved Atlas away from the wire and guided him along the outside of the ridge, keeping him several feet from the tunnel mouth. The dog worked slowly now, nose low, paws careful, tail level. The team followed in a loose line, giving Emily space without being told. That was the first sign that something had changed. 10 minutes earlier, they had seen her as an obstacle. Now they watched her like she was the only person who could hear the building speak. The ridge curved behind the abandoned homes, where sun-bleached boards leaned against collapsed stone. Emily stopped at a patch of dry weeds growing out of the hillside. Atlas pressed his nose toward the ground, then sat. Same signal. Same certainty. Emily brushed aside the weeds and found a wooden cover buried under dust. It was old, hand-cut, and almost perfectly hidden against the earth. Maddox crouched beside her, careful and silent. You are telling me he found that from air movement? Emily ran her fingers along the edge of the cover. Air movement, scent, pressure change, old soil, human traffic. He reads all of it. And you read him, Maddox said. Emily did not answer. She did not need to. Together, they lifted the edge of the cover just enough to reveal a dark shaft slanting down into the ridge. A thin stream of cooler air rose from inside. From somewhere below, the radio cracked again, weaker than before. Bravo 2. Can hear movement. Please respond. Maddox looked at Emily, and this time there was no challenge in his eyes. Only urgency. Can Atlas take us through? Emily checked the shaft, the dust, the edges, the silence. Atlas leaned forward, alert but not resisting. No rumble. No backward step. No warning. Emily clipped the glove back onto her hand and tightened Atlas's lead. This way is clean so far, she said. Blake swallowed hard. So he was not refusing the mission. Emily looked into the hidden passage, her face calm beneath the dust and sun. No, he was choosing the only way we had left. Emily went first because Atlas would not move for anyone else. The hidden shaft angled downward under the ridge, no wider than a hallway in an old farmhouse, its walls packed with clay and stone that scraped softly against their gear. The air inside was cooler than the desert outside, but it carried the same metallic warning that had come from the main tunnel. Emily kept Atlas on a short lead, one hand steady on his harness, the other hovering near the wall for balance. Behind her came Maddox, then Blake, then two more SEALs with medical packs and extraction gear. No one rushed now. Every step belonged to Atlas. If he slowed, they slowed. If his ears shifted, the entire line froze. The dog moved like he understood the weight of every man behind him. His paws touched the dirt without sound, his nose tracing invisible lines through the stale air. Emily watched his shoulders, his tail, the small changes in his breathing. She had learned long ago that a good K9 did not need words. Words came late. Instinct came first. After 20 feet, the passage narrowed. Blake had to turn his shoulders sideways to pass through a section where the wall had bowed inward. His breathing grew louder in the tight space, and he caught himself before speaking. Emily glanced back once, not with judgment, but with warning. Noise traveled strangely underground. So did fear. They reached a bend where the passage split in two, one path dropping deeper, the other climbing slightly toward the left. Maddox pulled out the folded map and angled it toward his chest light. Neither branch existed on the paper. Still wrong, Blake whispered. Emily looked at Atlas. The dog stepped toward the lower path, stopped, then backed away once. Not panic. Not refusal. Information. Emily lowered her palm. The team froze. Atlas turned toward the left passage and took 2 confident steps. Left, Emily said. Maddox folded the useless map and tucked it away. No one questioned her. The passage continued for another 30 yards before the sound reached them. At first it was only a faint tapping, irregular and weak, like stones settling somewhere in the dark. Emily stopped and lifted her fist. Everyone held still. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. Maddox's face changed. Bravo 2, he breathed. He keyed his radio, keeping his voice low and controlled. Bravo 2, this is Maddox. If you can hear us, tap again. For a moment, there was nothing. Then 3 taps answered from beyond the wall to their right. Blake closed his eyes, relief passing over his face so quickly he almost hit it. Emily guided Atlas toward the sound. The dog sniffed along the base of the wall, then sat beside a section of packed earth reinforced with old wooden boards. Not a danger sit this time. A find. Emily touched the board and felt a faint vibration from the other side. Someone was alive behind it. Maddox leaned close to the wall. We found you, he said, voice rough but steady. Stay calm. We are coming through. From behind the earth came a muffled reply, too distorted to understand, but human enough to change the air in the passage. The team moved with careful purpose. No shouting. No wasted motion. Blake opened the extraction kit and passed tools forward with hands that no longer shook from impatience, only urgency. Emily kept Atlas back a few feet and watched him closely. If the wall hid another warning, he would tell her before any instrument did. But Atlas stayed seated, eyes forward, breathing steady. Maddox looked at the dog, then at Emily. There was something like an apology forming in his expression, but the moment was too fragile for words. Emily gave a small nod toward the wall. "They are close," she said, "and Atlas says this is the safest place to reach them." Blake looked at her, then down at the dog who had led them through the earth without a sound. His voice came quiet, stripped of every joke he had made outside. "Then we follow Atlas." The first board came loose with a soft crack of old wood, and everyone stopped until the sound faded into the dirt around them. Emily kept one hand on Atlas's harness, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. He did not pull forward. He did not warn. He simply watched the wall as if he understood that two men were waiting on the other side of it. Maddox signaled for the team to continue. The second board gave way more easily, revealing a small pocket of darkness behind the packed earth. Cool air slipped through the gap, carrying dust and the faint sound of labored breathing. "Bravo 2, this is Maddox," he said, close to the opening. "We have a route to you. Stay still and conserve your air." A voice answered from the other side, hoarse but clear enough to be recognized. "Copy that, Senior Chief." The words changed the passage. Men who had been holding themselves like stone finally moved. Blake reached for the medical pack and passed it forward. Another SEAL widened the opening one careful handful at a time, removing loose dirt without shaking the support beams. No one needed to be reminded that the ridge above them was old and unstable. The tunnel had been carved for secrecy, not safety. Emily shifted Atlas back another foot and washed his ears. The dog's attention moved once toward the lower passage they had avoided. He stared into that dark bend for 3 seconds, then returned his focus to the wall. Emily marked it in her mind. There was still something down there. Maybe a dead end. Maybe another trap. Maybe the reason the main entrance had been wired in the first place. But the men came first. The opening grew wide enough for a canteen. Maddox passed water through, then a small oxygen bottle. A hand reached out from the other side, covered in dust but steady. Blake caught it with both of his hands. His face tightened, not from fear now, but from the effort of staying calm. "We have you," he said. "You are not alone." Emily looked at him for a second. Outside, he had joked about a frightened dog. Down here, his voice had changed into something better. The first trapped SEAL crawled through slowly with Maddox guiding his shoulders and Blake supporting his arm. He was dusty, exhausted, and blinking hard against the light, but he was alive. The second followed a minute later, moving with careful help from the team. When both men were on the safe side of the wall, the narrow passage seemed to exhale. Maddox crouched beside them, checking their condition with quick, practiced questions. Names, breathing, pain, orientation. They answered. Not strong, but present. Emily kept Atlas close, letting the medics work. The dog lowered his head toward the first rescued SEAL, who reached out with trembling fingers and touched the side of his harness. "Good boy," the man whispered. Atlas accepted the praise without moving his eyes from the lower passage. Emily noticed. So did Maddox. Relief had arrived, but it did not erase the mission. Maddox stood slowly and looked toward the bend Atlas had watched before. "There is more to this tunnel." Emily nodded. "Yes." Blake looked between them. "More wire." Emily listened to the silence, then looked down at Atlas. The dog's body had gone still again, not afraid, not eager, simply certain. "I do not know yet," she said. "But he does." Maddox studied the K9 for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Emily. This time, his voice carried no doubt. "Lieutenant Carter, Atlas takes point. We move only when you say we move." Emily gave Atlas a quiet hand signal. The dog rose, turned toward the deeper passage, and waited for her. In that dark underground corridor, command changed without ceremony. Rank still mattered. Experience still mattered. But for the next few minutes, every life in the tunnel belonged to the one member of the team who had never spoken a word. Atlas moved into the lower passage with Emily one step behind him. The lead held short, but loose enough for him to work. The rescued SEALs were being guided back toward the hidden shaft, but Maddox kept a small team with Emily because the tunnel had not finished telling its story. The lower path dropped at a shallow angle for nearly 40 feet, then leveled into a wider chamber supported by rough wooden beams. The air was colder there. Still. Too still. Emily stopped before Atlas asked her to. Something about the chamber felt arranged. Not abandoned. Prepared. Dust lay across the floor, but not evenly. Some areas had the soft, natural spread of time. Others were smooth, like someone had brushed them with a sleeve. Atlas lowered his nose, traced the edge of one clean patch, then sat. Maddox lifted a closed fist behind her, and the whole line froze. Blake, now directly behind him, did not make a sound. Emily angled her flashlight across the chamber from floor level, the same way she had done at the entrance. Shadows stretched long over the dirt. A faint line appeared, disappeared, then appeared again between two support beams. Another wire, higher this time, set across the chamber at knee level, nearly invisible against the dark wood. Emily felt Maddox tense beside her. She did not touch the wire. She studied where it led. One end vanished into a bundle of cloth tucked into a crack in the wall. The other ran toward a wooden crate half buried under loose soil. Everything was silent except Atlas breathing through his nose and the faraway shuffle of the evacuation team moving the rescued men toward daylight. Blake leaned close enough to whisper, "That is why the lower path was wrong." Emily shook her head slowly. "No, this is why the lower path was bait." The words settled heavily in the chamber. Maddox looked at the crate, then at the brushed dust, then at the space beyond the wire. He saw it now. The main entrance had been a warning for careless feet. The lower passage had been built to catch the team after they found another way in. Whoever designed the tunnel had expected trained men to adapt. Emily looked down at Atlas. The dog was not staring at the wire anymore. His gaze had moved past it, toward a narrow shelf carved into the far side of the chamber. It sat about 3 feet above the ground, hidden in shadow, too small for a person to enter, but wide enough for air to pass. Emily followed the direction of his nose and found the clue, a strip of faded blue tape stuck to the stone, almost covered in dust. Military tape. American. Maddox saw it at the same time. His expression hardened, not with anger, but recognition. Bravo 2 marked that. Emily nodded. They came through here before the chamber was rigged, or they marked another way out. Atlas rose without being told and took one careful step to the right, away from the wire, toward a line of flat stones along the wall. Emily let him move, watching every inch of ground before she placed her boot. He stopped at the shelf and pressed his nose to the opening. A faint draft touched Emily's face, cooler than before and carrying something different. Clean air. Outside air. Blake saw the change in her eyes. Another exit? Emily ran the flashlight along the shelf and saw scrape marks on the stone, fresh beneath the dust. Someone had crawled through there recently, maybe dragging equipment, maybe looking for a route before the air ran thin. It was too narrow for the whole team with gear, but it could guide them to the surface. Maddox lowered his voice. "Can we use it?" Emily looked at Atlas. The dog did not sit. He did not back away. He stood alert, steady, waiting. "Not from here," she said. "But it tells us where to dig from above." Maddox keyed his radio and relayed the position to the outside team, giving approximate distance, direction, and elevation. Emily kept her eyes on Atlas while he watched the shelf like a compass made of flesh and instinct. Blake stood in silence for several seconds, then looked back at the wire stretched through the chamber. "He stopped us twice," he said. Emily did not turn around. "3 times," she answered. "You just did not believe him the first time." The message reached the surface team in fragments, broken by stone and depth, but it was enough. Above them, men began moving with new purpose across the ridge, measuring distance from the hidden shaft, following Maddox's direction, and searching for the place where the narrow shelf might breathe into daylight. Below, Emily remained still beside Atlas, studying the chamber without touching anything. The second wire crossed the room like a quiet accusation. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. Its danger came from patience, from being placed exactly where hurried men would step while believing they had already solved the problem. Maddox understood that now. Blake understood it too. He kept glancing at Atlas, then at Emily, as if replaying every word he had said outside the tunnel and finding each one smaller than the last. "Surface team has a vent trace," the radio whispered. "Stand by." Emily turned her head toward the shelf. A faint sprinkle of dust drifted from the opening as someone above moved near the right place. Atlas's ears lifted. Not alarm. Recognition. Emily raised one hand, signaling the men behind her to stay still. "They are close," she said. Maddox answered into the radio. "Move slow. This chamber is not clean. Do not break through until Carter confirms." That was the first time he used her name that way, not as a question, not as a challenge, but as command trust handed across the dark. Emily heard it, but her face did not change. She was focused on Atlas. The dog stepped sideways, away from the wire, then looked up at the shelf and gave one soft huff through his nose. Emily followed his movement and saw a safer angle, a narrow strip of stone along the wall that avoided the brushed dust and the line of the wire. She pointed with 2 fingers. "If they open above that shelf, debris falls behind the wire, not onto it." Maddox relayed the correction. The response came back after several long seconds. "Copy. Adjusting." Time stretched. Heat and cold met in the underground air. Somewhere far behind them, the 2 rescued SEALs were being helped into daylight. Ahead of them, the chamber waited. Then came a muted scrape from above. A pin of sunlight appeared in the shelf opening, thin as a needle at first, then widening into a pale blade. Dust lit up in the beam, floating slowly through the dark. Atlas watched it without moving. Emily watched Atlas. The new opening grew by inches, careful and controlled, until clean air poured into the chamber and pushed the stale tunnel smell back down the lower path. No wire shifted. No boards creaked. No dust line broke. Maddox let out a breath, so quiet only Emily heard it. Blake whispered, "He found us a way out." Emily kept her hand on Atlas's harness. "He found us the way they missed." When the surface team secured the vent from above, a rope line dropped through the opening. One by one, the underground team moved back along the safe strip Emily had marked, staying clear of the chamber floor and the hidden wire. Blake went before Emily, then stopped near the shelf and looked back at her. In the narrow beam of sunlight, his face looked younger than it had outside, stripped of the careless confidence he had worn like armor. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "I was wrong." Emily looked at him for a moment, then gave Atlas a light pat along the shoulder. "Tell him." Blake swallowed, lowered his eyes to the K9, and nodded once. "I was wrong, Atlas." The dog simply looked past him toward the daylight, already thinking about the next step. Emily almost smiled, but not quite. "He accepts actions better than apologies," she said. Blake moved up through the vent without another word. Maddox waited until Emily and Atlas were the last ones below. He looked at the wire one final time, then at the dog who had stopped an entire team from walking into it. "After you, Lieutenant," he said. Emily guided Atlas toward the rope line, and this time, every man waited for the K9 to move first. Daylight hit Atlas first. His head rose through the narrow vent opening, ears forward, dust clinging to the dark fur along his muzzle. 2 SEALs at the surface reached down and guided him up with careful hands, treating him now with the same respect they would give any teammate coming out of a dangerous place. Emily followed a few seconds later, climbing into the hard white sun with dirt across her sleeves and one glove torn at the knuckle. The ridge looked different from above, less like a battlefield, more like a quiet stretch of earth that had been holding its breath all morning. The rescued men were already on stretchers under a shade tarp, awake, speaking in low voices while medics checked them. One of them lifted a weak hand when he saw Atlas, and the dog stepped toward him without needing a command. Emily let the lead loosen. Atlas approached the stretcher, placed his nose near the man's dusty hand, and held still. The SEAL closed his fingers lightly against the harness. "I heard him," he said, voice rough but steady. "Down there. Before I heard any of you." I heard his pause. No one laughed. No one looked away. Maddox stood near the entrance team, listening while explosive ordnance disposal specialists worked below with patient precision. The main tunnel remained sealed off, marked and guarded, its secrets no longer trusted. The wire at the first entrance had changed everything, but the second wire had changed the men. It had shown them that Atlas had not only sensed danger. He had understood patterns they had missed, pressure shifts they had ignored, and warnings too quiet for pride to hear. Blake Harris stood a few feet from Emily, helmet in one hand, eyes lowered toward the dust. For several minutes, he said nothing. The careless voice from the tunnel mouth was gone. In its place was a young operator who had seen the distance between confidence and wisdom and did not like how wide it was. Finally, he stepped closer. "Lieutenant Carter," he said. Emily looked at him, one hand resting on Atlas's back. "I said he was scared." Blake's throat tightened around the words. "I said it because I was scared and did not want it to sound like fear." Emily studied him for a moment. The wind moved dust across the ridge in soft waves. "Fear is not the problem," she said. "Pretending you do not feel it is." Blake nodded once. He looked at Atlas. "You were doing your job." Atlas blinked at him, calm and unreadable, then turned his head toward the medics as if the apology had already become old news. Maddox walked over before Blake could say more. The senior chief stopped in front of Emily, his face lined with fatigue, dust, and something harder to name. "I nearly overrode you," he said. "Yes," Emily answered. There was no anger in it, only fact. Maddox accepted that without defense. That would have cost us. Emily did not soften the truth for him. "Yes." For a long second, the only sound was the helicopter circling high above the valley. Then Maddox looked down at Atlas, reached out, and waited. Emily gave the smallest nod. Maddox placed his hand gently on the K9's shoulder. "Good call," he said. Emily's eyes stayed on Atlas. It was his call. Maddox looked back at her, and this time the respect was not formal. It was earned. "Then next time," he said, "we listen the first time." Emily clipped Atlas's lead shorter as the evacuation team prepared to move. The dog stepped beside her, steady and silent. No medals, no speech, no need to explain what he had done. Around them, the SEALs made room without being asked. Not for a frightened dog, not for a handler they had underestimated, for a teammate who had heard the truth under the ground before any of them were ready to believe it. By the time the helicopters lifted the rescued men toward the field hospital, the sun had climbed high enough to turn the ridge white with heat. The operation site grew quieter in the strange way places do after danger has passed, when radios still crackle and teams still move, but the loudest thing left is what everyone almost failed to notice. Emily stood near a row of sand-colored vehicles while Atlas drank from a collapsible bowl at her feet. Dust had settled into the creases of her uniform. A thin scratch marked one cheek where the tunnel wall had caught her on the way out. She did not seem aware of it. Her attention stayed on Atlas, on the slow return of his breathing, on the way his ears relaxed now that the work was done. Around them, the SEALs moved with a different kind of silence. It was not doubt anymore. It was recognition. Blake approached first, carrying a fresh water bottle and a clean cloth from the medical kit. He stopped a respectful distance away, not crowding her, not trying to turn the moment into a speech. "For him," he said, holding out the water. Emily took it and poured a little into Atlas's bowl. The dog drank once, then looked up toward Blake as if measuring him by something deeper than words. Blake crouched slowly, waiting for Emily's nod before reaching out. When she gave it, he touched two fingers gently to Atlas's shoulder patch. "Thank you," he said. Atlas leaned forward just enough to sniff his glove, then turned back to the bowl. Emily watched Blake's face. There was no performance in it now. No need to prove he was tougher than the fear he had felt. That mattered. Maddox came next, carrying his helmet under one arm. He stopped beside Emily and looked back toward the sealed tunnel entrance, where explosive ordnance disposal had marked the ground with bright flags and careful lines. "They confirmed both devices," he said. "Main entrance and lower chamber. Your read was clean." Emily looked at Atlas. "His read." Maddox nodded. This time he did not correct her. "His read," he said. Then, after a pause, "And yours." Emily let that sit in the hot air. She had spent years learning that respect offered too quickly could be as thin as disrespect. But this was not flattery. This had weight. Maddox looked at the men gathering near the vehicles. Team brief in 5. When the team formed up, he did not stand in front of them alone. He motioned Emily forward, and for a moment, she did not move. Then Atlas rose beside her, steady as ever, and they walked together into the open space. Maddox faced the team. "What happened in that tunnel was not luck," he said. "It was discipline, training, trust. We had warnings in front of us, and some of us almost talked louder than the evidence." No one needed him to name names. Blake kept his eyes forward. Maddox continued, "Lieutenant Carter and Atlas saved lives today because they listened before they acted. That is the standard." The words passed through the team without applause, without ceremony, and somehow that made them stronger. Emily looked down at Atlas. He was not listening to the praise. He was watching the ridge, the wind, the moving shadows, still working in the quiet way heroes often do. Later, as they loaded into the vehicle, Blake opened the rear door for them without being asked. Atlas jumped in first, then turned and waited for Emily. She climbed in beside him, resting one hand on his harness as the convoy began to roll away from the village. The tunnel disappeared behind them in a cloud of pale dust. Maddox's voice came over the radio, steady and clear. All units, move out. Emily looked at Atlas, and for the first time that day, a small smile touched her face. He had never needed to prove courage by charging into the dark. He had proven it by refusing to ignore what the dark was hiding. And every SEAL in that convoy understood the lesson now. Respect is not demanded at the entrance to a tunnel. It is earned in the silence before the first step.